And as I said before, today we are going to study what are the early ideas of inheritance. And as in any field, you start talking about the Greek philosopher and the influence that they have in important scientists, as I said, in this case, how they shape the ideas of inheritance of Darwin. So today we will talk about the ancient Greek civilization, and there are so many things that we can talk about the Greeks, and because they have so many discoveries and inventions that they still influence our society, especially the Western society. So, for example, they invented democracy, the heating system that are so important in countries like Canada. They created one of the first heating systems, and although it was thousands of years ago, they were able to do these things. They were able to calculate the circumference of the Earth. So the Greeks already knew that the Earth, instead of being flat, display an spherical shape. So it's a very interesting civilization and have a very interesting ideas about inheritance. So we're going to study some of those. So key ideas, I just said that these happened long time ago, thousands of years ago, and despite that it was thousands of years ago, they have an important influence in our culture. For example, democracy originates in Greece, and also they have other discoveries like the heating systems. And maybe you haven't heard this name, and I cannot pronounce it properly. I think it's Aristotle. No, Aristotle. Aristotle. Maybe you haven't heard about him. He lived long time ago, and he was a Greek mathematician, and he did something that I think that it was unbelievable. He was able to determine the circumference of the Earth just using shadows and establish a set of ratios. So, in other words, he used geometry to determine the circumference of the Earth thousands of years ago. And this is an amazing discovery, and it's unbelievable that thousands of years ago we were able to add just using math. This guy was able to find the circumference of the Earth, while here, thousands of years later, with cell phones, internet, we are going in the opposite direction. So, as I said, he drew a solid line and measure angles, and with that, he was able to in a very accurate way, to determine the circumference of the Earth. And I'm going to show you a video where Carl Sagan explained in a very neat way how he did it, and I think it's very clear, and I hope that you enjoy it.
Here's a map of ancient Egypt. I've inserted two sticks or obelisks, one up here in Alexandria and one down here in Syene. Now, if at a certain moment each stick casts no shadow at all, that's perfectly easy to understand, provided the Earth is flat. If the shadow at Syene is at a certain length, and the shadow at Alexandria is the same length, that also makes sense on a flat Earth. But how could it be, Eratosthenes asked, that at the same instant there was no shadow at Syene and a very substantial shadow at Alexandria? The only answer was that the surface of the Earth is curved. Not only that, but the greater the curvature, the bigger the difference in the lengths of the shadows. The sun is so far away that its rays are parallel when they reach the Earth. Sticks at different angles to the sun's rays will cast shadows at different lengths. For the observed difference in the shadow lengths, the distance between Alexandria and Syene had to be about 7 degrees along the surface of the Earth. By that I mean, if you imagine these sticks extending all the way down to the center of the Earth, they would there intersect at an angle of about 7 degrees. Well, 7 degrees is something like a 50th of the full circumference of the Earth, 360 degrees. Eratosthenes knew the distance between Alexandria and Syene. He knew it was 800 kilometers. Why? Because he hired a man to pace out the entire distance so that he could perform the calculation I'm talking about. Now, 800 kilometers times 50 is 40,000 kilometers. So that must be the circumference of the Earth. That's how far it is to go once around the Earth. That's the right answer. Eratosthenes' only tools were sticks, eyes, feet, and brains, plus a zest for experiment.
In class, we will watch parts of this documentary, and we will have a class discussion about this, how these things can happen, and what are the benefits and the problems, the disadvantage of internet and social network, and how this is influencing science, and how we change these kind of things. So I hope that you enjoyed the discussion in the class, and we can come to some solutions to these kind of problems. Okay, so I already gave you an introduction of the importance of the Greek civilization in terms of discoveries, in terms of ideas, and now I want to tell you a little bit of the inheritance about how they answered this question. And maybe you have heard about this name, Pythagoras, because he was a very famous mathematician, and in high school maybe you remember this theorem, the Pythagoras theorem. But he not only had an influence in mathematics, he also has ideas and influence on political and religious teaching. So, for example, he influenced Plato and Aristotle. And but he was remember that the scientific method was not developed yet. So the ideas at this time were half scientific and half mystic. So it's a very interesting view of the world, because you will see that although he had definitely a mathematics perspective that is still preserved, these ideas will live forever. These mystic, they have an age as well, his mystic ideas, and I will show you why. So, but he definitely was the earliest and most widely accepted theorist to explain the similarities between parents and children. So let's talk about those. Pythagoras had a theory that explained the hereditary information, and he called it the likeness. And both males and female had a function. So while the female's main function was the nutrition, the male had a function producing vapors. And so, for example, you had this guy, and he produced vapors. And believe it or not, he thought that these vapors, and remember that they didn't have idea what it was a gene, these very weird vapors go to the male semen. And for example, if this guy had this crazy hair, spiky hair, the vapors of the male semen, the vapors of the hair go to the male semen, and in that way his kid will have spiky hair. So, and this is what how he explained that children look like their parents. So let's recap what I just said to you. So I told you that the core of Pythagoras' theory of the hereditary information, it was the likeness. It was mainly carried in the male semen, so remember that it was called likeness, and that the male, that the body produced vapors, that they were responsible for new embryos, and that they contribute to the color, the skin texture, the bone length, the bones length, etc. So all the phenotypic traits, and that the female, well, the male was in charge of the carry the likeness, the female will be in charge of the nutrition. Maybe you have heard about the debate between nature and nurture, and in every field there is a small variation of this debate, but even Pythagoras talk about this. So, for example, in biology, genes are the nature, and the environment will be the nurture. So, for example, if cancer appear, the cancer originates because there is a mutation, that there is a defective gene, or On the other hand, it could be that the environment, that the food that you eat, the level of stress, or also it could be the pollution can lead to the development of cancer. So as you can see, there are a lot of variations, and it seems that right now we think that both are working together. But what I want to tell you is that Pythagoras even talk about that, and in his theory of inheritance, you will see clearly that he thought about inheritance in a mathematical background, from a mathematical perspective. So for him, there was a asymmetry in the theory of inheritance. And if you remember this triangle, his theory, he thought that the females were in charge of the nurture, while the males were in charge of the nature. And as a result of that, there was a triangular harmony. And the third, the hypotenuse, was the progeny. So, to some degree, the progeny depend on both the nature and the nurture. So let's recap. I told you that the male is supplying the nature for him, while, as I said before, the female is providing the nurture. So for him, he argued that heredity also was a triangular harmony at work. And finally, that the third side would be the progeny, and it was derived from a strictly mathematical formula. So again, he had a very mathematical perspective of inheritance, and although we know that this is not true, uh, however, it's very interesting to think that we are still trying to find a mathematical way to approach inheritance, and we will talk about that during class, and maybe we will watch some videos that of new researchers trying to predict our phenotype based on our genes, and we will see what are the advantages and what are the disadvantages of this kind of approach.